Good morning. I'm Steve Moskal.
And I'm Mary Moskal. I'll tell you a little bit about how we came to join First Unitarian. We moved here from Chicago area 3 years ago. And after we settled in, we started looking around for a place where we thought we could make a connection. And we started attending services here at First Unitarian. We saw an active, vibrant community that attracted us. And after we joined in this past January, we learned that the church was seriously considered a building plan.
Mary urged me to attend with her some of the first meetings about the expansion plan. And I should explain, before we left Chicago some years ago, we were the principal movers in a successful $10 million library building project. The community thought it was a tremendous benefit to them, and we thought that it was a tremendous benefit, and it was very successful.
We were impressed with the planning process here, and we were impressed with all of the input that the community gave to making the decision to go forward. The building committee was given the task of coming up with a building plan that considered all the needs of our church community, and I think we have all agreed that they have done a fantastic job.
They impressed us with a process that has been and continues to be open to the community members. After we made our pledge, we were asked to become visiting stewards, and after a few seconds of thought, said enthusiastically yes.
We both understand that giving is an important and personal decision, and we wanted to ask you personally to consider making a commitment to the new sanctuary building.
Timing is everything, and we believe the time is now for First UU. There's never been a better time, we know, for building costs per square foot to be considered in the plan. So with our pledges, we're going to all see the result of our donations. And I know, as many of you know, that when we make a pledge to an organization, we don't always see where our money goes. In this case, we're really going to see where our donation goes. So please be as generous as you can to make this project happen. Right now, we have enough to get it started, but we understand that there's not enough to finish it.
A little girl once told me, when you give, you feel good. Now it is time for you to consider making your contribution to the future of our wonderful church. Your contribution is important no matter how small. Every pledge counts.
During coffee hour. Before I begin my sermon, I want to take a minute to say a few words myself about this year's annual and capital campaign. You've heard me talk about the building project before, last January, when I preached a sermon to cast a vision for our future. And I've spoken from this pulpit about generosity and how giving to this church is a way of standing up for what you believe in, not just because of our mission to the world, but because we are this church, and it is what we make it. Conservative churches have money and visibility because their members give generously. In order for liberal churches to be successful, we have to do the same. You've heard me say all that before. What I haven't said is anything about my husband's and my own commitment to giving. Not all ministers join or give to the churches they serve. Some consider themselves to be separate from the membership, or they think it doesn't make sense to return part of their paycheck back to their workplace. Christine and I don't see it that way. We lead with, arm in arm with you, on a mission that we believe in enough to give generously to ourselves. Like many of you, my husband Carlos and I have children to raise, lots of bills, student loans. We just bought a little house, a fixer-upper that's kind of overwhelming to look at sometimes. Appliances that won't stay shut, gaping hole in the hallway, all the wrong furniture. And we feel vulnerable in this economy too. But we also know that during uncertain times, it's more important than ever to put your energy into the kinds of things that don't pass away, lasting things, the kinds of things that represent what's meaningful in your life. I've spent a lot of time with people whose lives were drawing to a close, and I've noticed that nobody looks back on their life and wishes they'd been less generous or that they'd worried more. Everybody looks for the things they did in their lives that were big, joyful, redeeming, or made a lasting impact. Carlos and I are looking for those kinds of things. It's the example that we want to set for our kids, and it's the story we want to be able to tell about who we are. We've increased our annual pledge by 30% this year, and we've made a pledge to the Capital Campaign that is more than 3 times our annual giving. It's the largest gift we've ever pledged to any cause, and I'm not going to lie, I felt a little nervous turning such a big pledge in because I knew it was going to require some sacrifices. Instead of even thinking about remodeling my kitchen, I've just painted it. We won't be traveling as much as we might have, and we're stuck with our sparse furniture for a little while. But making a significant gift for our new sanctuary has increased our sense of gratitude that we are able to even consider doing such a thing, and that we are part of something lasting and meaningful. It's a very good feeling. And that feeling, the one that comes when you give more than was easy, is just what it's going to take to get the sanctuary built. That's what I've got to say about that for now. I'm going to start this sermon off with a confession. I've put off preaching it for too long. It's been 3 years since I last sat in a gathering, in a class called White People Challenging Racism. A small group of white people gathered by 2 facilitators to examine the way we had benefited from and internalized racism in our lives. Because all white people have benefited from it, and all people have internalized it. No one is immune to racism because we're steeped in it from the day we are born. The point of the class was to open the participants' eyes and to get us to be honest with ourselves and with each other, and to get us to commit to doing something to help dismantle racism. And so as we went around the circle on the last day of the class and told each other what specific action we would take afterward, I pledged to preach a sermon on it. And then I promptly chickened out. I found that, as an op-ed in the New York Times put it, it's easier to talk about pornography in polite company than racial integration. It seemed like an awfully hard subject for a student minister, an intern at one of our largest and oldest New England churches, to tackle. What authority did I really have anyway? What if I said the wrong thing? And then after my internship, when I did occasional pulpit supply for other churches, it seemed like too heavy a subject to broach as a guest preacher. I wanted to have established a relationship with a congregation, for them to sense that I love them before we wandered into this territory. Even if it's immensely rewarding and satisfying to delve into, like pulling the veil off the elephant in the room, it's a conversation that for some of us can draw out feelings of shame and anger. It's a conversation in which it's easy to say the wrong thing, especially if you are, as the psalm says, only half wise, attracted to justice, trying to be good. Did those words resonate with anybody here? Is there anybody who loves justice and tries to be good but sometimes feels only half wise? Yeah, that's all of us. That's all of us. That's why we worship together. And so now, here I am, and here you are, beloved ones. And here we go. A sermon to say some of the things that I think are already in our hearts. A sermon to help us visualize and move toward the reality we long to see in our joyful, justice-loving church. First, some facts about racism and ethnicity in America today. it isn't a pretty picture, folks. There have been gains in the last century. We all know what they are. And we hear from time to time that the playing field is level now. Everybody is legally entitled to it, after all. And we've got a black president. Hallelujah. Our country has come a long way. Things are vastly better than they once were. But that's not the whole story. The whole story includes the fact that black babies are still more than twice as likely to die in their first year as white babies. And that compared to whites, nearly twice as many blacks and more than 3 times as many Hispanics are without health insurance. The true story has to account for the fact that 39% of black children live in poverty, 34% of Hispanic children do, and just 12.9% of whites, which is still too many. 29% of America's poor are black, which is bad enough since blacks make up only about 12.6% of the country's population, but due to media representations of black people, the public perception is much worse, with white people tending to think that half or more of all poor people are black. Let me rephrase that. Although just over a quarter of the poor are black, studies have shown that many white people think at least half of all poor people are black. And studies have shown that whites who think most poor people are black are more likely to vote for cutting welfare spending than whites who have an accurate perception of race and poverty. Ouch. In 1999, the sociologist Dalton Conley published a book called Being Black, Living in the Red that drew out some of the connections between history, race, and poverty. In 1865, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, he notes African Americans owned 0.5% of the total worth of the United States. That makes sense. Most African Americans had been slaves up until that point. But 135 years later, in 1990, African Americans still owned just 1% of our country's total wealth. Almost no progress, really. That year, the median assets for white families were about $72,000, while for black families, it was just $9,800. What could account for this? Well, one of the things Conley documented was the effect of assets being shared from one generation to the next. A very simplistic example goes something like this. If your parents had significant assets, some investments that they could draw on, say, to help you pay for college and put a down payment on a house, you would soon be debt-free and have significant home equity. You'd be accumulating assets of your own that over time would add up, and then you would go on to be able to help your children. If it takes money to make money, as they say, you would be well on your way. In contrast, if you pay for college with student loans and you rent because you don't have the down payment for a house, you will be deeply in debt and have no assets. Multiply this across generations, add other factors like whites getting paid more than African Americans for the same job, the higher rate of unemployment for African Americans, the lower rates of health insurance and adequate health care for people of color, and you can see why the American dream of equal opportunity and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is not all that it's cracked up to be. Latinos, whites, and others who come from families of little wealth will also recognize some of these dynamics. And there are issues of educational attainment, concentrations of self-perpetuating poverty, and underfunded schools. The list goes on, and you're already familiar with much of it, I think. Meanwhile, the language of race has changed. We've moved in our common discourse from Negro to Black to African American to person of color, which casts a much wider net. The word Hispanic is even suspect. Its official use is relatively new, adopted in the 1970s by the Nixon administration. It comes from the Latin word for Spain, and therefore, when used to designate groups outside of Spain, it refers linguistically to colonizers and racial oppression. Latino is not much better and is even newer and as an official term. Can we use these terms? It turns out that in the eastern United States, Hispanic is the preferred term for now, while in the West, Latino is the norm. What I think is important is to understand what they really mean. Actually, Hispanic and Latino are not racial categories at all, but are what we call pan-ethnic, meaning they refer to people from an array of possible countries and racial categories: Mexicans, Colombians, Puerto Ricans, or people from any other Spanish-speaking country with light or dark skin, straight or curly hair. Ancestors from Spain or Africa are called Hispanic or Latino based on their country of origin, not on their race. Within each country are racial designations that are in some cases even more complicated than what we have in the US. A while back I told you the story of signing my multiracial, multi-ethnic kids up for school and being unable to find an appropriate race box on the registration forms. Some more nuanced designations might have helped, but ultimately the categories just collapse in on themselves as increasingly multiracial children are born. We've moved out of black and white territory here, racially and metaphorically. There's uncertainty and change. Race as a category is breaking down even as it is still associated with systemic oppression. In the 1980s and 90s, we tried being colorblind. Maybe you remember the song by En Vogue. Anybody remember that? Free your mind, and the rest will follow. Be colorblind. Don't be so shallow. But it turns out that that didn't work very well because we're all conditioned to see race. And because if we pretend we can't see it, then it's awfully hard to acknowledge the systemic oppression that is bound up with it. And if we're colorblind, how do we navigate the authentic differences of experience that we have? Even as the categories of race are breaking down, race really is a way in which we experience our lives. Now, this can be a little tricky sometimes for white people to grasp, because if you're white, you have been taught all your life that you don't really have a race. And you've gotten the implicit message that you're just normal. White is the invisible race. If you are white, then all your life you've heard people of color described as black, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American, while whites were described as, say, about 5'7" with long hair and glasses, as though whiteness were a given. You've shopped in grocery stores that had ethnic sections, despite the fact that unless you're foraging in the woods and plan to eat your roots, fruit, and berries just the way you found them, all food is ethnic. If you are white, you've probably been unaware of the doors that opened for you, the warm reception you received from others, the possibilities that manifested in your life, but which would not have been the same if you were a person of color or if you had a name that did not sound quote-unquote American. You probably have not often experienced being the only person of your race in your workplace, at a restaurant, or in some other gathering, common experiences for people of color. I don't say all of this to make anyone feel bad. It's hard to know what you don't know, right? Just as systemic oppression is a result of what we in America have inherited from the generations before us and limits the horizons of our nation's dreams, so too have our faith communities inherited a fractured human community and limited visions of what a whole and healed community, a beloved community, would look like, or how to realize it. Churches mirror the society around them and are, in fact, still some of the most segregated places in our country. Less than 5% of the 300,000 Christian congregations in the country are intentionally multicultural and multiracial. Unitarian Universalist churches are not so different. Despite our Universalist theology and our love of diverse sources and traditions, this is true despite the fact that Unitarian Universalism and Christianity are both traditions based on a narrative of inclusivity. Jesus himself embodied plurality, multiplicity, diversity, or as Virgilio Elizondo puts it, Jesus embodied mestizaje, mixed race consciousness. Mestizo and mestizaje are words that used to refer to social castes in Latin America under Spanish rule, but now the terms have been reclaimed to honor the expanded consciousness that comes with being of more than one ethnicity or race. Jesus, Elizondo says, was of mixed race. Forget the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus you see in picture books. Jesus had brown skin. Nazareth of Galilee, where he lived, was occupied by Roman soldiers, and all kinds of people passed through it, which means that Jesus, culturally and linguistically, was a border person, a mestizo, not unlike New Mexicans. Yes? Not unlike us in this room. If you live in New Mexico, you live in a place where many borders come together and where people from many places pass through, and you too develop some border consciousness. And Jesus crossed the borders of cultural acceptability too, dining with prostitutes and tax collectors who were, you recall, not humble government employees, but were ruthless, going from door to door, collecting money and arbitrary fees from even the poorest of the poor, and then turning some of it over to the nation's wealthy leaders while keeping a fat profit for themselves. Jesus invited them to dinner and told them they were loved. It isn't that he let them off the hook. There was no Wall Street to occupy back then. But he could get mad. But he had what the Buddhist Roshi Joan Halifax would call a soft front and a strong back. Soft front, strong back. He loved everyone, but he insisted that they be loving also. The tax collectors and the unclean, the poor, the lepers, and people from different cultures. It was a challenge, even for him sometimes. In one perplexing chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, a Canaanite woman pleads with him to heal her daughter. At first he refuses, explaining that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. She's too much of an outsider, he's saying. But she argues with him. She, a woman, an outsider, has the nerve to argue with him, and he allows himself to be changed by it. Perhaps this story was needed in order for his followers to change course in their lives and to become more loving and inclusive without losing face. To have the strength, like the Canaanite woman, to speak truth to power. We aren't living the beloved community, the kingdom of God on earth, as our Christian brothers and sisters would call it, until our houses of worship reflect the diverse world in which we live. And I don't just mean sitting side by side. Diversity for diversity's sake is not a spiritually grounded goal. It's about becoming whole and healed people in a whole and healed human community. And we can't do that without all of us. One of the reasons it's so painful to talk about racism is because of how much we have to be accountable for as individuals, as a church, as a country, as a world. When we know better, we do better. All of our lives. That's how we grow. I remember sitting next to my husband, Carlos, who is Latino and has brown skin and black hair, in a church we'd belonged to for years, and hearing a white person who was speaking from the pulpit characterize our congregation as white. Now I know this person's comment came from a longing in her heart for her church to more fully reflect the diversity of the world around us. But her comment, "We are a white church," had the effect of making my husband and the other UUs of color who were present that morning feel totally invisible. It was very self-defeating. I've heard similar comments in this church and in other UU churches around the country. And before I knew better, I know I said something similar myself. When we know better, we do better. All our lives. That's how we grow. We are not a white church. We are a welcoming church. We are a congregation of people of many races and nationalities, and many people who don't fit in any category at all. And we are half-wise, attracted to justice, trying to be good. The story that binds UUs together is ultimately not an ethnic or a class one, but a story of radical love. Unitarianism, we are all from one source. Universalism, all are beloved. No one is dispensable. That's why I say that the Unitarian Universalist Church of the future is soulful, justice-loving, and anti-oppression. We are people with ideals that burn like fire in our hearts, like the psalm says. Oh, yes. When I talk to you, I can see that fire within you and your love, and sometimes also your worries and your fear. I see the spark of the divine within you, the spark of the source of all being that is a light within you, and the light within me responds to that. I hope you see that in each other too. This is what we all have in common, whatever race or ethnicity we identify with. Starting from that place, from the divine light within us, and listening, really listening to each other, allowing ourselves to be changed by each other, that's how we become the church of the future. We've just scratched the surface this morning. Just started a conversation that'll be ongoing. In the coming year, there will be some opportunities to engage more deeply with this reality of who we are now and who we are not yet. I'll let you know about them, and you're invited. For now, please rise in body or in spirit and join me in singing our closing hymn, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah.